As hostilities had begun at midnight on October the 4th, as the largest ever invasion in not just all of the history of war, but in human history in the more generalized sense, had kicked off with the hard kill anti-SAT weapon strikes, which included DN2s and 3s, as well as also S500s and other systems as well. Also, along with that, the tandem cyber strike coming in that affected everything in America connected to the internet, including even military networks, and taking all of it down with the booting on of various electronic warfare assets, whether aviation-based, ground-based, or even sea-based in some cases, which within their local areas effectively jammed all redundant communications and ISR capabilities that America could have possessed that was not dependent on the internet or satellite for functioning, such as portable radars, generator-powered, or radios. As the fourth-generation warfare doctrine involved the use of external forces and Trojan shock forces, which were those inside the nation that had been there for years, even to the point where they had been rotated in and out on a regular basis on CCP regime-owned properties, as the CCP regime owned most of America's major ports and was able to bring in all the logistics over the decades, as well as also the different units and their pre-positioned weapons and assets, even of their allies to boot. These forces had been laying in wait for this very day, and now that the invasion had kicked off, the pressure was on, as there was a strict timetable to adhere to by all of the coalition forces, as China, but also even Russia for that matter, were the undisputed leaders of the coalition, as Russia and China had cut many diplomatic deals and were not just very friendly with one another as allies and unlimited partners, which went beyond a standard alliance, but they had effectively carved up North America between themselves. And although China was getting the lower 48 and was going to keep control of lower Canada, ceding to Russia the northern 3 territories of Canada, Yukon, Nunavut, and Northwest Territories, Russia was helping to fight in the lower 48 because they needed to assist in vanquishing their main foe, which they saw as America, as the multi-year long war of attrition that they opted to fight instead of a rapid war against the proxy country immediately to their west, had shown that the collective West, especially led by America, was in effect a poison pill, one that needed to be discarded at all costs, and that meant that they needed to go along on this adventure with the Chinese to assist them in their war of conquest and subjugation and even annihilation. As the paramilitary and military forces of China, when combined, were enormous, a massive number of them were being utilized in this nationwide invasion, as paramilitary forces and military forces were effectively as common as one another on the battle map, meaning that the opportunity to run into military forces was every bit as common as running into Chinese paramilitary forces. The fighting closest to the border relating to Trojan shock forces effectively had the highest pressure placed on the command elements to deliver what was required of them, insofar as their objectives relating to the timetable as it pertained to securing the key invasion routes for the main invasion prongs of the external invasion components, as 3 of the biggest prongs moved through Texas and into different parts of the country, one literally going right up the middle of the nation, the other going into the southeast, and one going slightly into the Midwest. The forces in the far west moved up into Colorado and effectively were assisting all the Trojans that were deep inland doing the vast majority of the fighting. And by this point in time, The Russian Second Combined Arms Army, although it was spread out and committed most of its heaviest forces to the battle against Fort Hood, as there was a large American Army contingent there, with the 68th PLA Group Army doing the same, splitting itself in half, sending its heaviest forces of half of its group army to fight at Fort Hood and the rest to capture Waco, which was also seen as important, although compared to Fort Hood it was a sideshow. The rest of the 2nd Combined Arms Army was mostly deployed in San Antonio, although in Austin they had a division and also they had 2 battalions from their Air Defense Brigade. As the pressure was highest on the 2nd Combined Arms Army, including also the 1st Serbian Army Brigade, which was part of the Foreign Expeditionary Forces, which was under Russian command of their 2nd Combined Arms Army. It was attached to them, along with a Venezuelan brigade and even a Nicaraguan combat battalion, which were all integrated under Russian command of the 2nd Combined Arms Army in the battle in San Antonio. The Russians would be under high pressure to deliver by capturing rapidly San Antonio, overrunning all the air bases that were there, and hurriedly destroying the 81st Stryker Brigade, which was a National Guard force that was present in San Antonio, training at the time, as there was actually a training ground there that they were in the process of using, while to the north in Austin, in between the massive Fort Hood battle and the large battle in San Antonio, was the Austin battle, whereby paramilitary Chinese combat forces of the People's Armed Police, the cream of the crop, the most fanatical, fervent believers in the party, who would obey Comrade Xi no matter what he ordered, were effectively assisting the Russians, working together to take Austin and its numerous objectives within the city, as it was also strategically vital due to it being not only along I-35, but also because Austin possessed a portion of America's defense industries and even became a sort of miniature Silicon Valley of sorts, as many of America's technology companies had relocated to Austin and set up shop, as well as also the political significance, as it was the state regime capital and also the headquarters itself of the state's Air National Guard and Army National Guard elements in Camp Mabry. All of these areas were targeted by the different missile forces of the coalition, as well as also the air power as well. Also, there were American guardsmen bivouacked in Austin who had just been mobilized and arrived. As we go to the map of Austin, the area effectively had Chinese paramilitary forces on CCP regime properties, both within the suburbs and one, even within Austin itself, dangerously close to their objectives, as well as also Russian forces on CCP regime properties, mostly outside of Bee Cave and West Austin area and other suburbs, except for the Combat Engineer Battalion here. These forces would assist and work together with the Chinese paramilitary combat forces in securing rapidly all the objectives in Austin, as for the most part, the major combat operations would wrap up in 10 hours' time. There would be reverberating combat similar to the instance that occurred in the battle at Albuquerque, whereby American militia-type forces attempted a counterattack that was ill-fated and failed miserably. As 2 such attacks would also be conducted by Americans in this sector, the People's Armed Police would be a fanatically brutal element and would assist in not just roundups, but also in their forces behaving as mobile death squads, roving the area looking for anyone to take out their visceral hatred on, as they had been led to believe through propaganda indoctrination that American imperialists were trying to put China through another century of humiliation as they were indoctrinated, and this brought out the most vicious nature of many of these sociopaths that inhabited the People's Armed Police, as they were very similar to the Waffen-SS in many ways, and they would show this hatred on the battlefield. The Russian forces, by contrast, were very tough. They had fought a war of attrition that they chose to fight in Eastern Europe to bleed the West dry of ammunition and even equipment in certain categories, which they had effectively done an outstanding job of, leaving many nations sufficiently weak to the point where they can no longer really project power in any way, shape, or form. And as a result of the economic decline of America, they had to have budget cuts in their military forces, which affected their Navy, Air Force, and more, which played right into the hands of the coalition forces. Although the Americans still, on paper, had sufficient forces, at least for some sort of defense, they were not prepared for fourth-generation warfare. This only would have been maybe the case had they mobilized everything in time and actually had to fight a third-generation warfare where there were stable front lines, because in fourth-generation warfare, there are no stable front lines. There's no such thing as a front line from which nations can mobilize their people and industries and forces from behind. In fourth-generation warfare, there's only the line of contact where forces meet at any given moment. That made it impossible for a mobilization to occur, as well as also for there to be any effective defense, because the moment the satellites and the internet and everything relating to it went down and the redundant systems were jammed by electronic warfare assets, whether ground, air, or even sea-based in some cases, America was left in the dark. No actionable intel, no indication of anything, no knowledge of where enemies were, or nothing. This allowed for the coalition forces, with their massive available firepower and forces under arms, to exact a humiliating toll on American defending forces, as they would not see anything coming that came to them, as enormous artillery fire would come from the 130th People's Armed Police Artillery Regiment, as well as also the 207th Motor Rifle Division of the Russian 2nd Combined Arms Armies, 2 divisional artillery battalions. One was a BM-21 Grad rocket battalion. This is part of a firing battery right here, lined up firing their Grad rockets. It's a machine gunner watching the edges of the property where there's concertina wire set up. Another machine gunner watching this gravel road in. It's a CCP property used as a firing point for these BM-21s. Troops, roving patrols. There were also the Russian heavy guns, the 2S-19 MSTA 152mm self-propelled howitzers, such as these, pulling into a firing position as their crew-based quadcopter assets patrol the entire area to ensure that there's no enemy forces anywhere near them. And how could there be when the enemy, this early on, would never know where enemy forces were at any given moment unless they saw them right in front of them? As everything was gone, communications gone, there was no ability to coordinate anything in terms of defenses. There was no ability to do anything beyond spreading messages by foot or by vehicle, at least for a short time, as well as earshot from yelling and line of sight, like waving flags or hand signals and the like. As Russian forces, with their very capable weapons, including the T-72B3M, which might as well, again, be a brand new tank with its brand new gun, its brand new armor, its brand new engine, its brand new optics, its brand new ballistic computer and fire control system, this tank had proven itself time and time again in the Great Eastern European Proxy War by killing Challenger 2s, Abrams, and Leopard 2 tanks, and was a bona fide killing machine as a main battle tank. Arguably, the T-80 was a step up from the T-72B3M still, but the T-80Us fighting up in the Fort Hood battle were some of the heaviest forces Russia had to throw at the American installation, and thus the motor rifle forces of a motor rifle division and a brigade in San Antonio were equipped with the T-72B3M main battle tanks instead of the T-80Us, which equipped the 15th Separate Motor Rifle Brigade and also the 16th Tank Division, which were fighting in the Fort Hood battle alongside of the Chinese 68th PLA Group Army. As the Russian mechanized infantry forces were also very powerful and capable forces, they had their BMP-3 infantry fighting vehicles, their MTLB armor personnel carriers, and they had enormous support from their loitering munitions in the form of the Lancet 3s, which had AI target-seeking mode just like the Chinese CH-901As, although they could only be fired 5 at a time. Each Russian headquarters company of a battalion had a drone platoon with different drone sections, and each Russian headquarters platoon of a company had one. This in order to keep as many of these flying at a time as was humanly possible. The Russians also had squad-level quadcopter assets, just like the Chinese PLA troops did, of the active and reserve PLA forces, which were enormous. And many of the PAP did not have them at the squad level, but they at least had them at the platoon level, which was still impressive. As at the squad level, all their squad-level NCOs still carried the PDA form of the combat data links, just like Russian squad-level NCOs did as well. As the People's Armed Police had some forces with them at the squad level, while they had others that did not. The 43rd People's Armed Police Brigade deployed to fight alongside of the Russians in this area, as Chinese paramilitary units were filling this area, effectively filling this battle space. The 43rd PAP Brigade was effectively a regular standard People's Armed Police Brigade equipped with their wheeled APCs, which were the WZ-551s, and also the IFV versions, which had the upgun version with the 30mm autocannon instead of the 25mm, which was a step up from the 25, and they had that also on a remote-controlled turret with the Coax 7.62x54mm machine gun. The People's Armed Police, of course, had their own drone sections to fire the 48-tubed CH-901A TEL-like systems, which would get 48 of these in the air at a single time, which could be also set on AI target-seeking mode and can be equipped with a variety of warheads, as could the Russian Lancet 3s as well, as the Chinese could use an HE warhead, a heat warhead for tanks, or a fragmentation warhead for maximum shrapnel damage, which could destroy civilian vehicles and personnel with ease. As they also had their own artillery. They had an artillery regiment, the 130th PAP Artillery Regiment, which was backing up the 43rd at this battle. They were equipped with the widely mass-produced Type 59-1 or 130mm howitzer, which was effectively a go-between in terms of power between the lighter shells of the 105s that the Americans typically used, or the 122mm that Chinese and Russians and others used, and then the bigger calibers like 152s, 155s, and then of course the massive 203mm. These were effectively midway howitzers, which were still highly mobile for the use by the People's Armed Police, just like the Type 83 towed howitzers they also used en masse were, as these were all passed down from PLA service, and China still had enormous stockpiles of unused howitzers sitting in warehouses by the thousands. They had Type 83, 122mm howitzers, the towed type, not the self-propelled type, which they also had, which was a 152mm howitzer, which was a large self-propelled gun. They also had these Type 59-Is or 1s in large numbers, and PLL 66s in huge numbers, and the PLA still utilized those in sufficient quantities, as that was a very capable and destructive artillery piece, as 152 and 155 millimeter shells, for all intents and purposes, were nearly the same in their destructive power. There was not much difference. As the combat forces would fight savagely in this battle, and the People's Armed Police would effectively be vicious against their enemies in this battle, as they held a visceral hatred for their enemy, being the American people, as they believed the propaganda they'd been indoctrinated with, that the American imperialists were trying effectively to surround China and put China into another century of humiliation, making them burn hot with rage, as these were the most fervent party believers and loyalists to Xi Jinping and his regime. And these were effectively the cream of the crop, the elite of the paramilitary forces of China. They even sometimes fought more fanatically than even their PLA counterparts did of their regular army. These were China's effective equivalent to the Waffen-SS, as these forces were fanatical and were the Praetorian Guard forces of the CCP regime, or as some call it, the CPC. The Chinese Communist Party had at its disposal elite fighting forces such as their PAP paramilitary. They also had their PLA special forces units, and even the PAP had their own special forces, which were the elite of their forces. And some of them were deployed in different areas during this invasion to conduct very special missions. However, in this operation, the American forces that would be encountered by both the Russians and the Chinese would be brutally annihilated by a combination of the Chinese and Russian artillery fire, as well as also the air-to-ground ordnance dropped right on top of them, and Chinese and Russian cruise and tactical ballistic missile strikes, as well as tank-on-tank combat, as the T-72B3M would square off yet again with the Abrams and teach it a lesson in battle, as it had done in the Eastern European proxy conflict. Make no mistake about it, though, the Abrams was a worthy opponent of any other tank on the modern battlefield. Although it was an older design, and it had gone through its own upgrades over the years, similar to the T-72B3M, it was still capable of knocking out other tanks on the modern fluid battlefield. Although, with the lack of American ISR capabilities, as well as also the lack of adequate communications, minus very close range and word-of-mouth messengers, these forces would be brutally annihilated by an enemy that had ISR dominance that could see them long before they seen the Russians or the Chinese. Not only that, but the advent of the loitering munitions and the FPV drones that the Russians and Chinese also utilized at times were monumentally destructive against American vehicles and personnel, and would be utilized to great effect against American forces, along with airstrikes, artillery strikes, and missile strikes of various sorts, as American Bradleys would be smoking or burning on the modern battlefield, as would Abrams' main battle tanks, like so. People's Armed Police shock forces were trained especially well when it came to utilizing anti-tank weaponry. They were trained to function as hunter-killer teams for hunting tanks with their HJ-08 anti-tank missiles, which were absolutely devastating on any tank on the battlefield. With their own artillery support, not to mention the support that they could receive from their own air power in the form of their 4.5 generation Chinese designed and built JF-17B multi-role air superiority fighter aircraft, which, although armed for air superiority operations on their first sortie with predominantly air-to-air weapons, would have a small number of air-to-ground ordnance, including napalm canisters, as well as laser-guided or Baidu, or essentially satellite-guided, or even free-fall munitions to utilize in the close air support role if needed, and would be able to sparingly provide that service. However, the vast majority of airstrikes would be left to the Russians, as their Su-34 carried a monumental amount of air-to-ground ordnance, as this payload of 26,000 pounds per aircraft for their entire squadron of 12 aircraft would leave many areas outright annihilated, not to mention all of the different artillery forces, the different cruise and ballistic missile strikes from Chinese and Russian forces, as it must be remembered that immediately to the south of the 2nd Combined Arms Army, a Trojan unit, which was operating in Austin with its 207th Motor Rifle Division, as well as also 2 battalions in their CCP properties that were part of the 297th Air Defense Artillery Brigade, which was most of which deployed in between the Fort Hood battle space and the Austin battle space. They were about right here, as they were on their CCP regime properties to provide a massive umbrella of integrated air defense with their S-300s down to their Buks, which were mid-range air defense, all the way down to their Panstiers, which were very adequate close-in air defense elements, vehicles, equipment. As the Chinese also had their very capable air defense forces of the 68th PLA Group Army further north, in between Fort Hood and Waco. The entire area, all up and down Interstate 35, was well covered by a combination of coalition air defense forces and air defense aircraft, as in air superiority aircraft, to secure the airspace in conjunction with the air defense forces, all of it paired together by the Sino-Russian Coalition Artificial Intelligence Real-Time Battlefield Data Processing System, which made it very simple to communicate between these different nations with different languages and different weapon systems, to integrate everything together in split seconds to get rapid-fire return information by the second as it pertained to what showed up on combat data links, on targeting information, and so on and so forth, and more. These forces could respond with a higher degree of accuracy, precision, and speed than was ever before possible in warfare, especially warfare involving different nations with different languages, different forces, different traditions, different weapons, so on and so forth. The Americans would find it very hard going in this battle. Although this battle was nowhere near as massive as the Fort Hood battle occurring in the north was, as Russian and Chinese forces smashed their way into Fort Hood, as well as enormous missile fires slamming into it, along with rocket and howitzer artillery fires non-stop hitting the installation. Later on, the PHL-03 Chinese 300mm rockets that were in the Nolanville area at the Fort Hood battle would not only fire in support of the Waco battle, but they would also fire in support of the Austin battle, as flare-ups would come wherein armed reactionary civilians living higher up on the Edwards Plateau, as this was the gateway to hill country, as the Edwards Plateau was high ground, not quite mountains, but very hilly, with even canyons in it, chiseled by the Colorado River and other areas. And these forces would attempt to attack downhill against Russian military forces that they could see from higher ground. Also, forces from the south and even retreating forces fleeing the rampage of the People's Armed Police, who began in Del Valle at their CCP property, 1 battalion, would flee and join another group moving up from the south, thinking they were fleeing forces further south, only to run into People's Armed Police, fanatical paramilitary forces, ready to cut them up, both in the figurative but also very literal sense in some cases. As again, battlefield atrocities committed by the PAP would be so brutal in some cases that it would even turn the stomachs of hardened Russian combat veterans who were fighting alongside of the Chinese forces, as the visceral hatred that the PAP possessed for their enemy was very real. It could be felt, it was tangible. And they would, without mercy, cut their foe down, much like these forces who ran out into the street and got cut down by 12.7 millimeter fire before this half squad came out to check the area for this point man with bayonet fixed, having got this guy in the upper parts where sappy plate wasn't protecting before running him through effectively because he went to pick up his rifle after having been shot. That being one example of the type of hatred on the modern fluid battlefield that could sometimes come out in people. War brings out the absolute worst in people, and this was no exception. There's a soldier back here. They're all with weapons staggered, covering all directions. Soldier in the back throwing a hand grenade over in this area here. Loitering munition just crashed here, CH-901A. Like so. There's a column, double column rolling shield behind this APC. Flamethrower man with his Type 74 flamethrower burning up this rubbled building, with these forces firing into these from their turret-based machine guns on the armor personnel carrier versions of the WZ-551s that equip these regular PAP forces, the IFV and APC versions, with the IFV again having an upgun to a 30 millimeter autocannon, whereas others have the 25 still, but the 30 and the 7.62 by 54 millimeter coax equip the PAP forces of the 43rd PAP Brigade, with the 130th Artillery Regiment backing them up to the hilt with enormous volumes of artillery fire, as they would end up firing many thousands of 130 millimeter shells, just as the Russians would fire many thousands of 152 millimeter shells and rockets, 122 millimeter from their BM-21 Grad systems. There's one here, all the smoke coming out. There's rockets being fired in unison, saturating grid squares on this CCP property, conducting their fire missions. They had set up their tents, one for logistics, one for the battery command elements, effectively the headquarters platoon, which was responsible for the logistical pickups and distribution of rockets for their vehicles, as well as MREs, water, spare parts, fuel, POL products, everything you need to run a unit. Sandbag, machine gun emplacement, concertina wire surrounding this CCP property, another sandbag, machine gun emplacement, watching this gravel road and the perimeter, roving patrol troops here, stacks of rocket canisters. As the two S-19 MSTA forces with their patrolling quadcopter, crew-level quadcopter assets, as each crew, each gun crew or squad or section effectively had their own quadcopter, watching the entire area around their position as they set up to fire at American targets, with the Americans having no idea where enemies are this early on in the fighting. They would have no idea where they were taking fire from when it came to artillery. All they would know is what they could see in front of them. And that went for American military units as well. As mentioned again, there would be tank-on-tank fighting. There would be tank-killing units. There would be destroying main battle tanks as it pertained to People's Armed Police, fanatical light infantry forces, which most PAP forces were effectively categorized as elite light infantry, more or less. Although, again, the People's Armed Police does have artillery, mostly light, and they do have some heavy track-based forces, although most of their forces are, again, wheel-based light infantry forces, but they absolutely have anti-tank weapons as well, and they're experts at wielding them properly, as well as also enormous loitering munition support with heat warheads that can destroy these tanks by crashing down on the roof and annihilating the crew inside and the tank. So these forces also were definitely fond of their Type 74 flamethrowers. These would be used avidly as well, as these were effectively a terror weapon. And also, upon special request from the Major General of the People's Armed Police, effectively a one-star in the People's Armed Police, who was sent in to command all the paramilitary forces, as there was a senior colonel in command over the 43rd PAP, as he was the Brigadier General or Commander, and he was a colonel, a senior colonel, that was his PAP rank, over the 43rd. There was a regular standard colonel over the 130th Artillery Regiment, and then the lieutenant colonels commanded all the battalions, as there's also the 250th National Construction Battalion of the National Construction and Production Corps in this area as well, as their operation would be, as soon as the Russians and Chinese forces secured all the objectives on the Austin map, their objective would be to begin the construction of Laogai and mega fobs, which would almost exclusively be attached in the same location as the prison camps, or the Laogai, the slave labor camps, prison camps. They would have their temporary Laogai where they would rotate new captives through, and they would sort them with an AI categorization system, whether they were prisoners of war, whether they were armed civilian combatants, whether they were non-combatants, whatever they were. They would be categorized, and they would effectively be rotated through the Laogai system, and then it would be determined whether they would become more permanently housed at a certain economic location, like working in a mine, or effectively chopping down trees or farming. That would determine their job or their fate, because many would end up being effectively harvested, it could be called. And it would determine, the AI, their final location. Some would even be sent to China by aircraft from the Laogai. And they would be rotated through the Laogai on these fobs, as every fob would have effectively a temporary Laogai for sorting purposes, whereby the National Construction Forces would then continue on seeking out the farmland, which was the most important of all to the Chinese, as they wanted to become completely food independent, but also all the resources. One example being the precious metals that are found in Montana, such as silver and copper. Those would be extensively harvested, as Laogai would be built for permanent work in those areas as well, for one example. As Laogai would spring up throughout America, and even some in China would become full of Americans who would be sent back to be house workers for high-level party officials or for wealthy businessmen. The cruel system would be run by the People's Armed Police, of course, as many of their forces, combat and otherwise, had rotated through the Laogai system as guards back in China, so they had the whole gamut of experience, from combat to patrol duties to anti-riot duties to also partisan insurgent crushing activities, and of of course, again, combat activities, as they were fully capable of taking on enemy military units, or even other paramilitary units, as would be the case throughout this invasion. As the MSS, or the Ministry for State Security, the Chinese Secret Police and Foreign Intelligence Service rolled into one, would also work in the Laogais, interrogating new prisoners and assisting in piecing together intel along with the AI system. Much information would be gleaned from the non-combatant population, who wouldn't know better and be tricked into speaking to the MSS, who would try different tactics to get them to speak. Some would be a little more gentle than would others, as there would be certain measures employed in the Laogais to get uncooperative people to cooperate. The PAP and MSS-run Laogais were brutal institutions, and the National Construction and Production Corps 250th Battalion would be responsible for building the first Laogai and FOB on the site of the Austin Bergstrom International Airport, as well as also first deploying forces into the Austin Municipal Airport, as they would leave a company there before sending the rest of their companies to start working and building up the Megafob and Laogai complex on the Austin Bergstrom International Airport as soon as it was captured by Russian forces, who would move into the area as People's Armed Police forces would secure the flanks of the whole operation, as even some PAP forces would push out and away from the battle space entirely of the 43rd PAP. Some, like this battalion and this battalion, would move east and would actually effectively almost link up with the 616th Strategic Missile Forces Brigade, which was itself a Trojan Strategic Missile Forces asset, firing enormous salvos at Fort Hood, at Dyess, at Wichita Falls, including the Shepherd Air Base, not mainly, and also Fort Sill. Even some fired at the Oklahoma City battle, as was also, of course, the external missile forces of the 612th and 613th Strategic Missile Forces Brigades, these two having had been bolstered by additional called-up reserve battalions who were assigned to the enormous numbers of older tactical ballistic missile systems and even widely produced cruise missile systems such as the DH-10A, which is a very long-range subsonic but very destructive cruise missile that was produced in enormous numbers. And they would fire their tactical ballistic and cruise missiles alongside of the active duty battalions that comprise the 612th and 613th, who would be firing hypersonic weapons, as well as also the DF-21As and other newer Chinese ballistic systems and cruise missile systems, including even the DF-100 hypersonic cruise missile that flew so fast a coating of plasma formed around it, and between its rate of impact and its payload carried could create an enormous crater at the impact site, as could also their DF-17 intermediate range hypersonic ballistic missile with the DF-ZF hypersonic glide warhead, also a highly destructive, devastating, fast weapon that there was no counter to. The Russians as well had their hypersonics, such as the Kinzhals and the Zircons and even others, and had already as well employed these throughout this invasion in other parts of the nation, and were also in this sector, in the South Central Invasion Zone sector, using their 950th Rocket Brigade, which fired the tactical ballistic missiles known as the Iskanders, which had a 310-mile range and could hit Fort Hood from their position in San Antonio, as well as everything else in a radius from their position. And they fired enormous volumes of their tactical ballistic missiles at Fort Hood, with also a few even fired into this battle here, in the Austin battle, and others fired in the San Antonio battle in support of their ground forces and those of their allies, like the Serbs and the Venezuelans, and even the Nicaraguans, as they were attached to the 2nd Combined Arms Army, who was in overall command of them. In this area, the Chinese and Russians shared power, as again, a major general in the PAP was effectively a 1-star general in their paramilitary ranks, who came to command all of the paramilitary forces of China, including the 250th, which was from a separate paramilitary branch, but the major general who outranked him would command all these forces of the Chinese. He commanded the senior colonel over the 43rd, he commanded the regular colonel over the 130th, and he commanded all the lieutenant colonels over the other battalions, including this independent 250th Construction Battalion of the National Construction and Production Corps, effectively the paramilitary combat and civil engineers. They were equipped for combat, make no mistake about it, but their top priority was to build, and build they would, and fast. As it pertained to the Russians, their combat engineers were like elite assault infantry forces that could do everything from clearing obstacles and mines to laying obstacles and mines, as well as pontoon bridging, scissor bridging, as well as also acting as elite assault infantry against very hardened positions. And, of course, they could build as well, and they would assist the Chinese National Construction and Production Corps 250th Battalion in constructing the forward operating bases throughout this area of operations, which is a 20 by 20 mile area, east-west, north-south. As the pinnacle of the combat would revolve around I-35 for obvious reasons, which had to be taken within the shortest amount of time possible, as the external prong of 7 through 13 of the PLA group armies was battering ramming their way across the border at Laredo and about to push into San Antonio before reaching Austin and moving further north through Temple, Waco, then Dallas-Fort Worth, then Oklahoma City, and beyond into Kansas. That was one of the reasons why the combat in this area needed to be wrapped up as fast as was humanly possible. And again, much of it would be wrapped up in a very short time, with residual combat occurring later, similar, again, to what had occurred with the battle in Albuquerque, which was going on concurrently at the same time as this and all the other battles in all the other different areas of operations throughout the entire South Central invasion sector, which was predominantly Texas, but also New Mexico and Oklahoma. As Russian VVS and Chinese PLAAF aircraft screeched overhead, the artillery of the PAP and of the Russians began to open fire in earnest. The campaign had now begun, with also incoming missiles from the Russian 950th Rocket Brigade in the San Antonio area, and the Chinese 612th and 613th firing DH-10A cruise missiles, all about to be joined as well by the container-based Russian and Chinese systems, the Caliber Club Ks and the YJ-18Cs of the Russians, as the Russians were now heavily engaged alongside of the Chinese. They were hardened combat forces, just like the People's Armed Police, who were well-versed in crushing insurgents, as they had done it over the years every time insurgent forces tried to bring arms and weapons into Xinjiang. They had brutally crushed all of these uprisings and had ample combat experience, as did the Russians from their Great Eastern European proxy war. And both of these forces would utterly smash and annihilate the Americans in this battle, who would lack ISR communications other than word of mouth, line of sight, runners and would effectively also be outnumbered, as their military forces, consisting of the remnants of the 2nd of the 198th as Alpha Company, had gone to train with the 1st of the 200th in Albuquerque, as the 155th Armored Brigade Combat Team had sent the rest of the battalion to Austin, as it was part of the 36th Texas Infantry Division of the Texas National Guard, and Camp Mabry was the headquarters. They decided who went where insofar as the 36th, and they made the agreements with the federal regime who worked with the states on this, as critical infrastructure had to be protected in the Austin area. However, the bivouac troops of the 1st of the 355th, a reserve battalion, whose headquarters, by the way, was in Round Rock, and the rest of the 2nd of the 198th would be outright annihilated by the entire artillery forces, missile forces, and air power contributed to this battle that would all be utilized against these forces, not to mention the very potent ground forces of both the Chinese and, of course, the Russian forces as well. The Battle of Austin will continue in the next video of this hypothetical documentary series highlighting 4th generation warfare doctrines